Welcome to Strength in the Numbers. My name is Andrew Codd, accountant, author, and commercial finance entrepreneur, and it's my job each week to bring you leaders in finance and business and deconstruct with them their real stories, insights, and hard-won lessons into practical advice on the key strengths and qualities you need to remain relevant in accounting and finance today, as well as the steps you can begin to take to elevate the impact you make to have a fun, successful, and rewarding career in accounting and finance. Now let's go over to the show.
Like most companies, large companies had, loads of accounting policies covering everything from reserve accounting to how you value assets to how to fill in travel expense forms. And when I typed into the corporate controllers database forecasting, I got 0 hit. Everybody said forecasts are really important and our forecasts are rubbish, but nobody could say what good looked like.
Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Strength in the Numbers show. Now you've just heard from Steve Morlidge. And Steve and I managed to catch up just before the Christmas holidays, and we weren't under too much time pressure. So that allowed us to really examine Steve's career all the way back to when he was responsible for implementing beyond budgeting at Unilever, to actually how his career evolved from answering some of the key questions that challenge all of us. And actually one of the introductory comments you just heard around forecasting, how many of us in our organisations have or consider forecasting as really important, but where's the standard operating procedure around it? Where's the approach on how we eliminate bias? How can we get the insights across in a better way? How do we filter the data, make sense of it? How do we provide clearer picture to the business? And also, I think a lot of us intuitively know the pitfalls of traditional budgeting and variance analysis. But hey, guess what? That's what a lot of our organisations are still looking to us to provide, or perhaps we're just still providing it and not examine the better toolkits. And the great thing about having Steve on this episode, and this is a part one of a two-part series, is that Steve helps us better understand the toolkit, those better toolkits that are out there, and how we can implement them in our own organisations. One of the things I most enjoyed about having Steve on the show is that there's just no BS about what he says. It's completely straight, matter of fact, because I think that's what you need to do when you're examining these areas that involve potentially a lot of subjectivity. And it's really refreshing to get that point of view. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If you did, you can check out our timestamp show notes, key quotes, resources, and ways to connect with Steve and more at SITNshow.com. And we always really appreciate it when you recommend the show to your colleagues and friends. They can subscribe on all the major platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Spotify. And that's enough for me. So without further ado, over to Steve and the show. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me. Our
pleasure to have you on. And, we've spoken a few times over the last few months. We managed to meet up in London as well. And I would say your name is fairly well known in accounting and finance. However, this is a global show and some of our audience may not be as familiar with some of your background. So would you perhaps maybe mind sharing a brief story of your career in accounting and finance?
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. Basically, my background is I'm a regular qualified accountant. I worked for Unilever for 25 years, and my last proper job in Unilever was as financial controller of Unilever's foods business in the UK. That led into a sort of second career after Unilever, which has taken a form which is distinctly unconventional.
And I think that's a bit I'd love to explore with you, Steve, because some of your thinking and writings and the progression of them I find are very much useful to help us in finance sustain our momentum towards remaining relevant and creating valuable conversations within our organisation. So how did you sort of get from that end of your conventional career, so to say it, to where you are now?
My last proper job as financial controller, I had the fantastic opportunity to build something from scratch. It worked great and I had a fantastic time, but I became increasingly aware of how a number of things I did just didn't work or didn't make sense. And in particular, there was the issue of the annual budget, which was the most obvious manifestation of that. And really, my journey started when I was introduced to a couple of guys in the late 90s called Robin Fraser and Jeremy Hope, who were in the process of setting something up called the Beyond Budgeting Round Table, which was an attempt to construct a research community to look for alternatives to traditional budgeting. So that's how it all started, but it's kind of got a bit out of control since then because I haven't been able to stop.
But seriously though, you say that, but that was my sense in our conversations we've had to date. It's just like that seems to be where it was the turning point. And like, you know, for this podcast, the reason why I set that up is I felt that we needed to share more of our stories about what worked and what didn't. And I don't want to make you feel old or anything, but much before even I thought of setting up this podcast, you were there already realizing this doesn't work. What can we do about it? And looking for answers. And it's not just answers, but I like how you're finding practical solutions and deconstructing them down so we can actually use them. It's practical stuff you're finding, mixing what you're learning now with perhaps your sort of practical career, your career as a practitioner, let's call it. So it's actually really useful stuff, and it's more apt for modern day conversation, right?
Yeah, I hope so. So if you like, there are kind of couple of ingredients, if you like, that run through all of my story. One is a kind of recognition of the things I did wrong and did badly. I don't beat myself too much up about it because everybody makes the same mistakes, and indeed most of the mistakes are things that you're actually taught to do. Secondly is I kind of got a nerdy interest in theory and the kind of science behind things. But then the third ingredient is that it's absolutely pointless understanding the theory if you can't apply it. And so I'm trying, in everything I'm doing, I'm trying to come up with solutions that the me of 20 years ago could use to actually do things well rather than do things badly.
And that's why we just had to get you on the show. I'm going to take those ingredients now, Steve, right? I'd love to go through them because I think that first one, I'd just love to get your perspective. You know, what's been perhaps maybe the biggest mistake of doing stuff that we were taught to do in your mind, like, or what we're continuing to do. So, you know, we've listeners out there probably putting into practice loads of things they've been taught to do. What's probably the biggest mistake we're doing at the moment in our profession?
Well, I think what it boils down to is the fundamental problem with budgeting, which is we've got a whole system of management which is predicated on the assumption that we can predict the future. And we can predict the future and we can lock down plans. Then the second assumption is we assume people are untrustworthy, and so we force people to comply to those plans and reward them for hitting numbers and beat them up for missing the numbers, even though the numbers are based on predictions, which we know is wrong. And what lies at the heart of all of our methodological struggles is our failure to recognize and deal with the fact that the world is uncertain. We work on the assumption it isn't uncertain or can be made more certain, and it can't. So it's fundamentally about developing a toolkit which allows us to deal with uncertainty and the fact that our knowledge of the world evolves. It's not something that can be crystallized at a single point in time.
Well, I like that. So maybe let's say if we were to arm ourselves then with this toolkit to deal with uncertainty, I mean, what tools would you pack in your toolkit?
Well, perhaps a good place to start is where I started. So if you'll just indulge me a little bit, if I go into reminiscing mode. When I first started with Beyond Budgeting, it became a kind of an obsession trying to work out what it was about this idea that made it intuitively appealing and yet actually difficult to see how it could be applied in the world. So that consumed me for a while, and to cut a long story short, I decided that's kind of what I wanted to do with my post-conventional career. So I got myself onto, I was very lucky that Unilever was kicking off a finance strategy project, which was really important and exciting. But one of those projects, like in any large company, nobody wanted to get onto, because it represented a kiss of death as far as a career was concerned. But from my point of view, that wasn't an issue. We had a fantastic opportunity going around the world for about a year, talking to whoever we wanted to, and building a finance strategy for Unilever, part of which was an attempt to bring beyond budgeting into Unilever. And that strategy project turned into a real project. And I put my hand up to volunteer to actually lead that beyond budgeting implementation in Unilever, which all happened, which was great. And then I was faced with the practical challenge of how do I make this happen? Because at that time there was just me, and there was 200,000 people working in Unilever, and budgeting is a huge process which informed so many other aspects of corporate life. Any kind of change was difficult and scary. And where I started was in the forecasting space, because I realized I was trying to eat an elephant, so I needed just to take part of the beyond budgeting model, and also recognize that one of the reasons why people were anxious about letting go of budgeting, even though they knew it didn't make sense and it took too long and all of that kind of stuff, was that it gave them some kind of handle on the future. People aren't going to let go of what Peter Senge calls one brass ring until they've got another brass ring to hold on to. So I started off looking at forecasting, because it's one of those things that everybody said was terribly important and was done very badly, but nobody had any clear idea about how it should be done. What was the right way to forecast? And I did some research, and nobody in finance seemed to know how to do that. So that's where I started off. From that, and from what I learned, came my first book, which is called Future Ready, which is, I think even now, I think it's still the only business book dealing with what I call business forecasting, which is forecasting in the middle ground. So it's not operational forecasting, which is very short term. It's not strategic forecasting, which is very long term. It's that forecasting in the middle ground. And the key attribute of business forecasting is you forecast the future in order to change the future, because you're using it to steer, and you might change course and in the process invalidate your forecast. So there are some qualities of business forecasting which are rather unique, and which I don't think anybody kind of thought about or explored or tried to convert into some sort of practical methodology. So that's where the first book came from.
I was just thinking, Steve, like that's a big shame, because one of my sort of bugbears is traditional accounting and finance training arms us with great tools to go and do reporting and analysis and ensure controls are put in place and so on. It just seems to sort of stop there. It doesn't really sort of say, okay, this is what we're learning. How do we go do something about it? And I think that's where you're coming in with the business forecasting. It's like, what's the point in putting together something that's forward looking if you're not going to do anything with it and drive or navigate, help the business navigate? So, maybe could you share some sort of tips? Because for me, I do think this is something that we could do better in our profession, is do something with our forecasts that's useful.
Yeah, well, it's perhaps a bit of a long story there. I might, if you don't mind, I'll duck that question. Because I'm conscious the listeners to this podcast might want to go to sleep, go to bed at some point in the next few hours, because that's quite, it's a good question. It's a big question.
It's a big question.
But maybe I'll come onto it right at the end. Actually.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, okay.
I think there's something more fundamental than that, which is a problem I encountered at the early stage of my research into what ended up as the book, which is everybody said our forecasts are bad, but how do you define what a good forecast?
Yeah, okay.
Like most companies, large companies had loads of accounting policies covering everything, but reserve accounting to how you value assets to how to fill in travel expense forms.
Yeah.
And when I typed into the corporate controllers database forecasting, I got 0 hits.
You're just reinforcing the point I just made. Exactly. We're great at compliance, but something that's useful.
Everybody said forecasts are really important and our forecasts are rubbish, but nobody could say what good looked like. So that really annoyed me. And so that started another journey, which has ended up being a bit of a a tangent to my main forecasting, my main finance journey, which was starting off with a qualitative definition of what good looks like for a financial forecast, which for the benefit of listeners is a forecast with zero bias, which is not consistently over or under forecast, and with acceptable levels of variation, which is what that means is that any forecast is going to be wrong, but so long as it's not so wrong that it causes you to make the wrong decision in terms of steering the business, that's okay. That's where it started. And then the obvious next question is, okay, so how do you measure bias? How do you know if a forecast is biased? And that got me into stats, and I discovered a tool that had been lying around for about 30, 40 years that nobody in finance used. And so I developed a quantitative method for measuring the quality of forecast. Then I found out that although I developed that for finance, there was no kind of market for the idea in finance because forecasting wasn't sophisticated enough to try to measure it. So I ended up taking that into supply chain, where, as you'd appreciate, still in an FMCG type company like Unilever, people are forecasting thousands and thousands of forecasts on a very high level of frequency. And the quality of those forecasts has a direct impact on how much stock you have, quality of your customer service, and so on and so forth. So I took that into supply chain, built a software around that, and got diverted for 4 or 5 years into building that company that delivered that particular service, which is helping people to work out how good their forecasts were and consequently correct them. Ultimately, that became my third book, which is called The Little Book of Operational Forecasting, where, because there was no book for operational forecasters, demand managers, demand planners, that wasn't highly statistical and consequently theoretical and not terribly useful. So I wrote that book to try to give practical forecasters, demand planners, the intellectual framework to help them do their job better, irrespective of whether they used my software or not. So that was a bit of a diversion. And since then, I've got back much more into kind of mainstream finance.
And before we sort of go into that mainstream finance area, it sort of concerns me a bit, Steve, that, a lot of us out there would probably be challenged. I know you gave a definition for what a good forecast looks like, but if we can't even get to good, then there's no chance we're going to be able to get to great. So yeah. How do we even get to good? So maybe, is there any sort of tips that we could use to remove bias, or thoughts on how we can better quantitatively make our forecasts better?
Well, I think that this really simple things, the fundamental thing is recognizing that there is it's an important and necessary distinction between a target and a forecast. And that sounds kind of obvious, but it's the thing that most people struggle with. So a target is an aspiration where you would like to be, and a forecast is an expectation, is where you think you will be, based on current plans, assumptions about the world, etc., etc. And there are those two things. Most of the time, there will be a gap between them. And what you do as managers is try to close that gap by doing things differently. So it's think of it like sailing. So you want to get to a port, but and you set out in what you thought was the right direction, but the wind has changed direction, and so you're heading off in the wrong direction. And what you need to do is to recognize, first of all, that you're heading in the wrong direction, and that therefore there is a gap between your forecast and your target. And then you need to work out what you need to do differently. The problem we have is that one of the problems with traditional budgeting, it kind of conflates the idea of a target and the forecast, because all the numbers are made to agree. We lose sight of the fact that those two things are different. And what's more, it makes the concept of a gap bad, because it's a negative variance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of organizational pressure that comes on people to deny the existence of gap, because you get punished if there's a gap.
Yeah.
And you don't have instead of having a conversation of what you need to do differently, you're beaten up because you're, inverted commas, not performing. And so there is a whole series of behavioral repertoires that get rolled out people say things like that forecast is not good enough, which stops us from tackling the process of forecasting in the way we need to, which is a sort of objective evidence-based exercise of trying to project where you're going to end up if you carry on doing what your plans currently say. So that's the fundamental problem, is recognizing intellectually that there's a gap and then changing the behaviors which tend to be manifest around discussions about the forecast. It's not a prediction, it's a projection, which is different. And it's actually good that there's a gap, because then you have the conversations which you need to have. That's the fundamental problem that we have in finance. And it's not just a problem that affects finance, because that kind of debate tends to leak into other areas. So one of the biggest problems with operational forecasting is that it becomes infected by this disease. And that's why we end up with too much stock or poor customer service.
Yeah, that it feeds into what's actually happening on the ground and on the front lines, which, look, you've outlined the problem very well, Steve. I just sort of scratching my head at the moment, like where could we in finance even start change? I don't know if we could successfully change a culture that's like that, but where could we do our best to at least start changing the conversation to appreciate, look, there is a difference between a target and a forecast. And what we need to be doing is driving different behaviors. How do we bring the rest of the organization along?
I think that there isn't a simple answer to that, because like any change management question, where you start from, we know where we want to get to, but everybody's starting from a different point. I mean, one would like to think that you could have a rational discussion and explain to people why this is a problem, why this is important, and what the problem is, and they'll go, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. Andrew. Yeah, we're all going to change tomorrow.
Exactly.
That's rarely happened to me. So
yeah, but that's why I'm scratching my head. It's but we're all looking for a similar goal here, which is to reduce uncertainty, and have something to cling to, and that's
embrace uncertainty,
embrace it,
and then deal with it.
Yeah,
rather than hide it. That's the key thing. Yeah.
I mean. Look, I suppose. Look, I was lucky when I joined one company early in my career. It was a fast-moving consumer goods, and what they did very well was they did have aspirational targets, but what they also did was operationally they looked at the best P&Ls and they said, look, it's unrealistic to expect everyone to be at 100% on that dimension or whatever. But if you could get to maybe 80% or 75% of that level of performance, what would an ideal P&L look like? What is attainable? Everyone can get near the best. You don't have to be the best. And actually, when you bring people together and drive with real data, conversations, you're trying to eliminate bias. I'm not saying the 75 or 80% is right, but there's some level of performance you get buy-in on. And then you can start moving people to take constructive actions where they're not sort of inflating inventory numbers to drive better gross profits or something like that. But essentially there are things we can drive at the operational level that hopefully might help behavior change over time. Is there any sort of success stories or things you come across, Steve, that you could share with the audience?
Well, I mean, everybody's experience is unique. I think there is potentially a way in which we in finance can influence the way that people think without actually trying to tell them that they need to change the way that they think. And that kind of leads into the next area we could talk about, which is what ultimately ended up as my last book, which is Present Sense. If you'll just indulge me, I can talk a little bit about that.
Hey, look, it's a great way of getting in there, because I think we're leading towards this, because there's some important points in Present Sense I'd love to share with our audience. So yeah, please continue, Steve.
Okay. Well, I'll start off by explaining what I meant by my last comment, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of issues that we're trying to deal with in the present sense. The analogy I always use, which has been a very successful one in talking about forecasting, if you think of if you're in a sailing boat, you start off from point A, you're trying to get to point B, but as you start out, your assumptions about how the best way to get from A to B change, because you can't predict what's going to happen to tides, the wind, and so on and so forth. So you find yourself heading in another direction. And because we tend to think, when you've got that kind of image in mind, you think about the trend. So if we're aiming to go north, but we're heading in a northeasterly direction, we know that if things continue as they've started, we're going to end up carrying on going into the northeast and rather than to the north. And consequently, we need to tack and go northwest and to get back to where we wanted to. So this idea of looking at performance in terms of trends and trajectories, because what I find, and that's kind of where the present sense book started from, is when you convert numbers and tables of numbers into pictures, and pictures which show performance in terms of trends and trajectories, all of a sudden it becomes obvious whether a particular set of plans is credible or not, because you tend to get hockey sticks and stuff like that.
Yes, the real world.
I think, irrespective of the kind of rational arguments for moving away from sort of conventional tables and variance analysis, using pictures which show trends helps people to think about the problem differently and to expose the gaps, the inconsistencies in targets, plans, actual numbers, which tend to get hidden because we're just overwhelmed with digits. So I think that's a good way to begin to subliminally change the way that people think about the problem. And the thing about measurements and reporting is that's one thing over which most finance people have total control. You don't have to make a business case to introduce a graph into a report. You just do it. Yeah. And if it works, people will go, oh, that's great. You don't have to convince people. They will convince themselves. If it works, you don't need to make a rational argument for it. So I think that's a good way to help to change the nature of the conversation in most organizations. And as I say, that's the kind of genesis of the Present Sense book, but it won't surprise you to know that it took on a life of its own as soon as I started trying to write it.
Yeah, well, look, I know. I mean, I could see that, Steve. I mean, you know, when I was just, you know, I had the pleasure of reading an early preview on it, and again, thank you for that opportunity. What I also liked in there was you actually examined some areas in neuroscience, you know, on how we can better exploit our natural strengths in brain. So like there you just mentioned about an opportunity to exploit our natural positioning in organization around measurement and not having to get a business case to introduce a graph or a chart. You know, what strengths could we perhaps leverage from a neuroscience perspective in your mind? Yeah,
well, perhaps to answer that question, I'll back up a little bit. Because I think before I get into that, it's perhaps worth kind of explaining the problem before we kind of get into solutions. So that right back in the day, I'm talking about kind of 2001, 2002, I kind of got stuck in my early days in Beyond Budgeting on a problem, which was, if we don't have budgets, how do we measure performance? Because we've been drilled into thinking that performance is a gap between a target and an actual. And if we're saying it doesn't make sense to have budgets, which are in essence thousands of targets, if we're saying it doesn't make sense to do all that and to try to predict and lock things down, how do you measure performance? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how absurd variance analysis was, because number one, a budget is just a guess, and it's usually politically motivated. That's just if you take it in a year, and then you take this politically motivated guess, and by some arbitrary mechanism, we split that guess down into lots of little guesses called monthly budgets. So you've got a guess, and then you're comparing that with a single data point. And everything we know about the natural world says that any measure has an unknown amount of noise in it, just random things that happen that mean the number is, you can't regard a single number as the truth. So you're comparing a politically motivated guess with a number with an unknown amount of noise in it. And then you're thinking somehow that the difference between those two numbers is meaningful. It's just absurd. It just can't be meaningful. But and then you throw into the... Sorry, Andrew, you jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, but a lot of us are actually still doing this absurd behavior.
We're locked into it.
Locked into it. Locked into it, yeah.
Yeah, we're locked into it. We can't think differently. And then you throw in big data. So we go, wow, this is great. We've now got millions more data points than we used to have.
I know.
And you go, okay, so that means that you have much more noise than you ever did have before, because the more granular the data, the more noise. And so you're going to do 1 million more targets?
Well, yeah, but you see,
I don't think so.
No, but you see what I got the image jump in my head there now, Steve, of some of our finance and accounting colleagues probably spending days a week, taking all these millions of data points now because of big data and comparing them against these absurd stakes in the ground, these guesses, and their job is producing waterfalls to plan or budgets or these monthly guesses or bridges from a variance analysis perspective, and we're not really moving the business forward. It's trying to explain something back that really was a bit of an absurd guess to begin with. And I just feel our time is better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, it's meaningless. And it's worse than wrong because we're producing these stories to effectively... It's a bit like when you look up at the clouds and you see a cloud that looks like, I don't know, Elvis.
Yeah, yes.
And you say, well, there's Elvis up there. And it isn't Elvis. It's just something that looks like Elvis. And people go, oh, yeah, you're right, that is Elvis. I think that's what a lot of our business commentary is like. We've got noise. We've come up with a story which creates the sense of a superficial resemblance to something which you recognize. And that becomes the truth.
Yeah.
And then people make a decision based on that. That's the worst thing. Yeah. People think that is the truth, and it isn't. It's just patterns we've seen in noise. So it's intellectually absurd, and also it's a waste of people's time and talents and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's where I started from. I got kind of some techniques that I think would do the job better, like trend analysis, and there are some techniques that have been around for donkey's years which help people filter out noise, things like control charts and so on and so forth. But as I was writing the book, I was thinking, this kind of, how can I make this all hang together? What are we really trying to do here? And to eventually come around to answering your question, that's where it became clear to me that the problem that we have, if we're sitting in FP&A or something like that, and we've got all of this data, what we're really trying to do is to make sense of it. We're trying to work out what is going on, particularly what is going on that is relevant to what we're trying to achieve, the purpose of our organization. And if what's going on is consistent with the purpose of our organization, we call that performance. And if it isn't, we say it's poor performance. And then it kind of became clear to me that's the problem that fundamentally that our brains have, that we are assaulted by enormous amounts of data, and we have to work out some way of working out what's relevant and what's not relevant, and based on, so in other words, what we can safely ignore. That's the most important.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then the stuff we need to pay attention to, we're attributing meaning to it. And that's our job. How do we attribute meaning? And then having done that, which is great, we then have the problem of how do we communicate that meaning to other people? Because it's not enough for us sitting in FP&A to know, in inverted commas, the truth. If we can't communicate that to people, that's useless. And so we have then a second problem, which is also related to the brain, which is how do other people assimilate information? And we have to communicate meaning to them in ways that makes it easier for people to assimilate quickly, but more importantly, for people to get the same information and draw the same conclusion. So you have to start from how do people's brains work? And so that's the second way in which the brain becomes relevant to this whole area of performance reporting. And there's just a lot of stuff out, because this is an area where science has advanced enormously in the last couple of decades, which means that you can come up with a series of practical solutions to help people do that. And a lot of it revolves around the intelligent use of graphics, because our brains are fundamentally a visual engine. That's what our brains do well. It's a struggle to extract sense from tables of numbers, which doesn't mean to say they don't have a place, but at the moment it's the only club in our bag.
So there you have it. Hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to know more about our guests today, their bio, and follow up on the resources mentioned during the show, you can find all the relevant links and more at sitnshow.com. There you'll also be able to get access to earlier shows, read the latest blogs. There's also an opportunity to subscribe to our newsletter, which will give you heads up as to when the next show is coming out, latest events, news, and anything that's going to be relevant to help you have a fun, rewarding and successful career in finance and accounting. And just before you go, we really appreciate your feedback. If there's something we can do better on the show, something that's not working, or something you'd like to see, even a guest you'd like for us to invite onto the show, someone who you think might be able to benefit you more and also the rest of our community, please let me know. You can email me. I'm at andrew@sitnshow.com, or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just drop me a message so I know how you found me and we can connect. And really, it's our community that'll make the show. If we keep engaging and driving each other on, we'll keep on building our strength in the numbers. When all is said and done, if we can do the numbers better and finance better, we'll create more opportunities for ourselves, our friends, our families, our communities and our businesses. So until next time, have a good rest of the week, take care, and let's keep building our strength in the numbers.